there are some other first generation Ugandans who are listening in so that we can kind of bridge our community together. Okay? So yes, we're being punctual, starting on time. So I'm just going to reintroduce myself. My name is Vanessa Nansamba. I am the current Miss Uganda North America, and it's again so happy to have you here. And then we have our wonderful and like lovely panelists who have given up their time to be here with us and share their experiences. So whomever wants to go first, just let me know, and you can introduce yourselves.
I think ladies first, you know, I'm a gentleman.
Okay.
Okay, hi, my name is Michelle Mukasa. Most people call me Mimi, and I competed in Miss Uganda North America in 2008, and I got Miss Personality, and every year I've been coming back to mentor the amazing women, and yeah.
Right. My name is Mukisa Chibaya. Where do I begin? I am, I guess, one of the first children of the diasporan community here in Chicago. I've been very involved in the community. I get that example from both my parents, my mom, Margaret, and my dad, Sam. May he rest in peace. I actually served as the secretary of the community, which is now the Ugandan community in Greater Chicago. Wow, so many years ago. Now I am working with our youth community here in Chicago, and when I'm not doing that, busy working, working with the youth formally and informally, and just pursuing my hobbies and, you know, living life and enjoying the city.
Okay. Thank you, Mukisa. All right, fellas.
All right, I guess I could kick it off. What's up, everybody? My name is Sam. Grew up in the Chicago area. I got to know Nessa and Mukisa when I was young. Left Chicago for college and then career in 2013. Currently in Ogden, Utah, military. Not a lot of Ugandans out here, but just make the most of that. I remember that was back in 2013 when the Uganda community in Greater Chicago, we had like a small youth startup called like New Generation. I remember working with Kisa with that, and yeah, it was just a huge part of my growing up experience. Really fortunate to have be surrounded by so many Ugandans and growing up here. But yeah.
Ahmad, you want to go ahead?
Sure, I'll go. My name is Ahmad Jingo. Grew up in Atlanta, Georgia. I moved to Houston, Texas, went to college here, and pretty much I've just been working here for the most part. I guess my interest would be martial arts. For the most part, it's pretty much what I do for fun outside. Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is my main thing. And I've been to Uganda a couple of times, and I really think that there's a lot of lessons I've learned from Ugandan culture, which we're going to talk about more. But I think that's just a pretty quick intro to who I am, what I do, how we got here.
Greetings, everyone, or as they say in Uganda, Sanso Kubalava. My name is Jumba Mugwanya. I'm born in New Jersey, raised primarily in Woodbridge, New Jersey. That's my hometown. But my life experiences, my life journey has taken me to many different states in our country, different continents and different nations. I'll get into my story a bit as this program goes on. But yes, like everybody on this panel, have Ugandan ancestry, both parents born and raised in Uganda. My father came to Chicago in the late 1970s. And my sent from my mother the next year. My family's been in the United States since. I went to school in Atlanta, followed that with some schooling in Florida. Now I'm back in New Jersey working. I make my home here with my wife in the city of Camden, New Jersey. And yeah, I'm excited for this panel. Thanks to Vanessa and all the organizers of this event for putting together. Thanks to UNA as an organization. I'm dating myself a little bit, but probably the first UNA convention I ever went to was, I think, 97 or 98, Atlanta. And it was a great time. And I've pretty much been going to UNA since. So thank you.
All right. So thank you all again for being here. I really appreciate it. And so what we're going to do is begin our panel. So our panel is going to be more of discussion based, just to let you guys in the audience know. And we're just going to just bring up different topics and figure out, okay, what are the different perspectives on each of them. So before we actually begin going into discussion, I kind of want to make sure or give people a background or a demographic of where you from or how you demographic where you from. So in the sense of, yeah, I'm from Chicago. I grew up in a mostly Black and brown being Hispanic neighborhood up until middle school. Up until pretty much high school, I was the only Black woman in my grades, up until I transferred out to a different high school. And then from there, it was mostly white and Asian, like majority at the schools. And then after that, I've pretty much been in different white institutions. So the reason why I want to make sure we give that background is because I think the people that you're surrounded by and people that you engage with, they do have an effect on your perspective and your outlook and how you view yourself and how you view the world. So while I'm saying that about myself, I want you to kind of give a background of who have you been around in your life. Also, I forgot to mention, before I mention this, I have been around the Ugandan community all my life, just like Mukisa. Before I pass on the torch, just like Mukisa said, I was like literally born in the Ugandan community in Chicago. A lot of them raised me together as a community in Chicago, up in Milwaukee as well. So throughout my life, yes, I've had that home base of the Chicago or Midwest community being my community. But at the same time, those are the different places that I've been in that kind of affected how I see the world and how I interact with the world. So if you guys could also give me your different perspectives, and then we'll again jump into the discussion.
Okay, I'll start first. And I was born and raised in Pasadena, California. It's close to Los Angeles, and in a very diverse community. There was even a Ugandan church that we used to go to, and just like a heavy Ugandan community that I grew up around, a lot of uncles and aunts. And then about in high school, when I was in second grade, we moved to Washington State. And originally we didn't really know many people, but there was a great Ugandan community, which we grew to love. And I started going to school in a predominantly white school, and we were the second Black family. So before us, there was only one Black girl at that elementary school. And then when me and my sister got there, there was three. And going to college, I've been to a couple different colleges, but most of them have been predominantly white institutions. But the Ugandan community has always been in my heart, and I always found our little pockets of Ugandan uncles and aunts to mentor and be there. So, yeah.
Thank you, Mimi. Anyone else want to follow up?
Sure, I'll jump in if I can. So I was born in the 80s in New Jersey. My life, I was born, just to give people a geographic sense, I'm from the central part of New Jersey, about 30 minute drive from Manhattan, New York City. And I spent the early years of my life there, but my life experience has kind of been in different places due to my father's career and due to just life circumstances. So I lived abroad in Southeast Asia first, then I also lived briefly in Uganda at the beginning of my adolescence. I lived in Uganda for about a year to 18 months. And I came back to New Jersey where I finished middle school and high school. As I mentioned, I went to college in Atlanta, Georgia. I went to law school in Florida, and then I came back to New Jersey. So pretty much been different places, different environments. But to describe my childhood neighborhood, or where I consider my hometown, Woodbridge, New Jersey, primarily middle class, blue collar. I guess you could describe it as white ethnic. It was primarily Italian, Polish, and Portuguese families. My particular street, my particular area of the town was where many of the Black families tended to live. My street was predominantly African American families and also Caribbean American families. That's what I grew up around. Those were my influences. But as far as New York, New Jersey, and the greater tri-state area, the metropolitan area, we had our Ugandan community, and that was definitely a big part of my life. And we still continue to gather with the same folks till this day, 30 years later. So that's kind of my upbringing, my experience.
That's lovely. Oh.
Thank you.
I'm sorry. All right. So who else want to go next?
I guess I could go next. I had a pretty mixed upbringing. I grew up in the Chicago area. Of course, how I met Nessa and Mukisa. Growing up, it was a mix of predominantly white schools and predominantly black schools. So it was like, for example, my freshman and sophomore year was at a predominantly white school. My junior and senior year was at a predominantly black school. All of my middle and elementary school was at predominantly black, but my primary was like predominantly white. And then when I left for college, my college was in Colorado. So a bit fewer black people in Colorado than there are in Chicago. Then I studied engineering. I was most times the only black person in the room. And then when I graduated college, I got stationed in Utah. And my time in Utah, the biggest development for the black community is going from 1% of the population to 2%. And it's not even like we doubled. It's just we got to the point where we could round up to 2%. So yeah, ever since leaving Chicago, it's been predominantly white experiences, but I've had a great time.
All right, I guess I'll go next. Atlanta is at least the part I grew up in was a mostly African American part until high school. That's when I was in a mostly white institution because it was a private school. So it was mainly white people, a lot of African Americans, not too many Hispanics. And even amongst the black students, it was mostly African American. I think in like my entire grade, there were 250 of us, and like 3 of us were children of African immigrants. So I didn't really run into immigrants a lot. I went to college in University of Houston. It's a very diverse institution. In fact, like it doesn't have a majority race. Like there are as many Asians, Hispanics, and whites there. There are less black people, but it's a very diverse school. And in terms of the work environment I was in, my first job out of college is in the healthcare industry on the management and finance side. And it's mostly women in the healthcare industry. And then it's also mostly immigrants too. So not just from Africa, but from the Middle East, India, any part of the world, immigrants tend to just flock towards healthcare. So that's pretty much been the demographic I've been around the most in my professional career. And then even here in Houston, I'm still in the healthcare industry and the finance side. So I'm meeting because it's more in the finance side, I'm meeting a lot more like white people and I guess, yeah, mostly white people, but then also seeing a lot of like Hispanics. There's a lot of Hispanics here, a lot of Africans, because like I said earlier, the industry tends to appeal to immigrants a lot more. So that's pretty much been my upbringing.
And then last but not least, Mukisa, right?
Yes. Okay. Well, how to describe my upbringing? So, growing up in Chicago, some of you may know, some of you might not. Chicago is top 5 in terms of segregated cities in the nation. So where I was raised in predominantly black neighborhoods. So where I lived was always black. All I saw was black faces. This, where I am in my life, I'm thankful for that. But where I grew up, all I saw was black people. In terms of where I went to school, my mother was a staunch advocate for public schooling. I also thank her for that as well. But because of my intelligence and the Chicago public school system, like Jumba, I'm a late 80s baby. But I went to selective enrollment schooling here in Chicago. So I tested into a gifted school. And so that's where I saw the non-black faces. But I did sit with the black girls, the black kids at school, and I played with them. So for 1st through 6th grade, to a gifted school, and then for 7th and 8th grade and through high school, went to Whitney Young. Also the school of a very famous alum. You might know her, Michelle Obama. Yeah. So both of my schools, I would say my high school, Whitney Young, more so than where I went to elementary school, was more diverse. But I think Whitney Young, the way I was raised to be around Black people. So I had my Black friends, and then of course at Whitney Young, I was used to being around, Latino people, white people. I hate to say it this way. I had some of my white friends from high school, and I do have one of my best friends, literally from like first grade all the way up until now, and she's white. But I would say in terms of my diversity and where I experienced diversity, it was from school. Literally, I can think of maybe 1 year in my life where I haven't lived around Black people. I've always lived around Black people, and I would experience being around other races of people in school. And then now that I work in healthcare, I'm a pharmacy technician. That's where there's mostly Asian people. There are a few white people depending on the places that I've worked. That's also where I experience diversity and unfortunately non-Black faces as well.
Okay. So you may ask, okay, so why is that the first question I want to start off with? Because what we're going to start from is when we're younger. So when I was younger, like I said before, I grew up in Ugandan community. That's all I knew was Ugandan community until I went to school. So when I was at school, that's when I got the term Black. I didn't know what Black was. I thought Black was a color, like a literal marker color. You know what I mean? So I'm like, after that, I was like, okay, they're like, well, you're Black. And I'm like, no, I'm Ugandan. Like, I don't get it. You guys can unmute yourselves, and have talk. So when I was much younger, I felt it was very difficult to know what my identity was, because I feel like a lot of different people kept telling me what I am. They were like, oh, the color of your skin, you're a Black girl. But then they'll be like, oh, your last name is Nansamba. Okay, no, you have to be African. Or the way I had an accent when I was younger, one accent. And they're like, well, you talk like you're African, so maybe you're African. How did you really identify when you were younger? And like, what influences came into like what you identified as?
Yeah, when I was younger, I think that like the area where I grew up in LA, knowing that like as a child, there was a lot of diverse culture and like just a lot of different people. There wasn't a lot of judgment of like, oh, you're this or you're this. It was just kind of a lot of people coming together to express like who you were. And I grew up in a Ugandan church. And so like I always associated with Ugandan American. And when I moved to Washington and Seattle, where there was less culture, and more so like my white fellow counterparts, a lot of people wanted to tell me like what I was. And like, I did hear like, kind of like, oh, you're Black and this, but like, for me, I always knew I was Ugandan American, and it wasn't really like a question or confusing. It was more so like, why is it in this school, it's kind of silenced to be Black? Why is it so different or like antagonized? Like they're touching my hair. The other Black girl doesn't play outside at recess, and she's shy, and so I think that the perspective that I came from with a lot of diversity helped me kind of go into a wider space and understand, I know who I am, but like, I don't know why you're treating me differently, kind of. So, yeah.
I feel like I had to learn how to be Black, how to be comfortable in my skin. I remember growing up, some of y'all may have been called this before, but I got called African booty scratcher quite a bit growing up. Like, so for a while, it's like there was a while where I hid the fact that I was Ugandan. I actually no, I'm not gonna publicly admit to that. But there were a lot of phases I went through, because I like, and that's why I'm really grateful for Ugandan community in Greater Chicago. Just the exposure there, and then also getting the chance to go back to Uganda. We used to go back every 2 or so years, and just like own our narrative. There's so many narratives that get pushed out for like most folks that like especially here in Utah. I mean, much respect, much love to the people here in Utah, but like like the narrative, like when I say Uganda, there's one ubiquitous narrative that comes to mind, and it's just straight up abject poverty, war-ridden, this and it's like, that's like one, that's like, have you ever been to Uganda? And two, uh, it's like I recognize that when you're only around white people and people that don't really only espouse that narrative, it's really easy to it's really hard to own your narrative, but it just took me a while, and it took me a while to just be able to own my narrative and first understand my narrative and then own it. But yeah, it's been a wild ride, I'll say that.
Sam, I feel your pain. I went through those struggles. They made fun of us being African, but it's all right. It's all right. We made it through, and it builds character. And I mean, but truly, it's kind of amazing to see the pendulum swing the whole other way, to where the first Black president in the United States has African ancestry himself, to the fact that you can hear African music on MTV. Like, you could have never told me that as a child, that's how Africans will be understood and perceived in America. So it just goes to show you that change does happen.
What a time to be alive.
Indeed, right? Indeed. As far as myself, to be honest, when you grow up with your name being Jumba Mutasa Mugwanya, there's no real doubt about where you come from. You can't pretend to not be African. You can't pretend to not be Black. I've been African. I've always identified as African American. It's kind of crazy because a lot of us take for granted that there's always been that term African American. We weren't always referred to as African. It took Jesse Jackson creating and introducing that term to popular culture in the 80s for that to catch on. Before people were just like Michelle was saying, people were just called Black, like a color, not really given an identity, or called Negro, But yes, African American, it's a term that I've identified with because I feel like it literally describes my experience. I'm of African ancestry through both of my parents, born and raised in Uganda. And then I feel every bit as American as my peers. Like, my father particularly raised me, and I'm kind of proud of the fact that he raised me to see my fellow Black people here in the United States as brothers and sisters. When I went to school, I learned about Frederick Douglass and I learned about Harriet Tubman, and I brought that home and I was doing my homework. My dad was telling me, that's your history. He wouldn't tell me that that's their history. He told me that that's part of my story. That's part of my identity. So I've always seen my Black American brothers and sisters as part of my brothers, even though they can't necessarily trace their ancestry back to Uganda per se. I've always seen them as fellow Africans stationed here in the United States. And I've always identified as African American.
Yeah, and definitely to piggyback on what Jumba said, for me, I think it's also a part of how I was raised. My parents and Jumba's parents are contemporaries. My mom is Jumba's godmom, and when his parents were here, they were close friends. And my parents were part of the 70s, and they really took that that brotherhood, that kinship with African American people here seriously. Some of y'all might know, if you come into this house, if you come into my mother's house, you will never hear my mother say she's not Black. That's how I was raised. So, and being raised with African American, with Black friends, I was always taught to I was always taught to respect and to know of my Ugandan heritage, and I was always taught to see myself as Black. So, these are my brothers and sisters. Just as I educate myself and I know of my, Ugandan heritage, I study Black history and I educate myself, and I get that understanding and that learning of, my brothers and sisters here as well. And I took that invitation into African American, into Black culture seriously. and how I was raised, how I was lived with the people here, I can't see that's how I identify myself as well. Now, for me, I do make that distinction. I know our ancestors didn't go through slavery. That's a trauma we don't have. But in terms of, in terms of being here, in terms of the struggles that we go through here in this day and time, until you get my ID, I'm Black. Until you get my ID, I'm Black. I'm, of course, I wouldn't trade my name for everything. And I've made, let me tell you something. It's hard being Mukisa when Lion King comes out. I'm telling you. It's I caught lots of heck that 2 weeks when Lion King came out. But I really did. I hid in the bus for 2 weeks when Lion King came out. But to get that feedback from my friends to say, because of how proud you are of your heritage, you make me want to go visit Africa. I want to come to Uganda because of you. That's,
yes.
The testimony that I have. And that's also the kinship I have with people here.
Okay.
And for me, that's what I stand for. And I think that's what I want us all to stand for, not only in terms of kinship, but building community. Because I think I'm not the only person that's got it from both sides. Like, that's got enmity, not only from Black people, but also from Ugandan people. And for me, I stand for understanding and I stand for building bridges. And we won't get that unless not only that we identify with people, but we also learn from people.
And then Ahmad, why don't you let me know if you have anything to add on to this conversation, and then we're going to go to answering some of the questions in the chat, okay?
Yeah.
Thank you, Mikisa.
For one, I think everybody made some good points. It got me like reflecting and thinking a bit. Because the truth of the matter is, I haven't really thought that deeply about like my identity as a Ugandan. I've always had the mentality of any sort of culture I come across or any sort of belief system I come across, take what's works for me and then leave what doesn't. So that's kind of the way I've always approached my relationship with my Ugandan ancestry. There's a lot of values in there, like the concept of family, the concept of sharing, the concept of each one teach one, each one builds one. Those are all values and principles I've chose to take from the culture. But with what y'all said, I would be lying if I said I thought about it that deeply. But I definitely think that value of building each other up, that's definitely a value, I guess, at least when I look at my family, both my mom and dad's side, they made it a point that if you get educated or if you get somewhere in life, somebody helped you along the way. Like somebody paid for your tuition, somebody let you stay with them so you could go to school. Somebody really put in significant and material effort into making you who you are in order for you to get there. And then you do the same for other people. So that's definitely a principle and value that I've taken from the Ugandan culture that I use to this day. And that's, there's really not much more for me to say about it.
Okay. All right. So we do have a couple of questions that are coming in from the chat. So I'm going to ask a couple of them. We have two coming from Mastura, but the second part is actually something that we're going to discuss later. So I'm going to go for part one. So what is the understanding of being Black for you guys? For me, I can say Black means that you have ancestry from Africa. So if your ancestors are from the continent of Africa, that's kind of what I will go with being Black. But I know how that can get tricky because of Northern Africa and how some of their ancestry can come from either Europe or is it the Middle East area. But for me, that's what being Black is. And that's why even now, I identify myself as Black, American, Ugandan, all those mixtures put together. I don't know if that differs for any of you guys on here.
No, I'd agree. I think it's I think you gave a pretty good operational definition. I guess Black is just like an umbrella term, but I would prefer to see people say African, but I guess we're just probably not there as a society yet. So I guess it's easier to just look at the color of our skin and say that. But I guess, like you said, we all have African ancestry. I mean, they call them African Americans, Afro Latino. You know what I mean? So that all means ties to Africa. So that's how I see it. Same way.
Yeah. I've gone. For me, like I like the description as an umbrella term, because that's really how I see things. I've had a couple of discussions with my fellow. I'll explain why I'm calling them Black in a second. But yeah, in a lot of discussions with them, a lot of them don't prefer to be called African Americans, because I have one friend. He just straight up told me, it's like, I don't have any connections to, my roots in Africa.
I've heard that before.
And just that well, not necessarily alienation, but that disconnection there. Like for them, like the term Black covers, like it's all an all-encompassing term. And I think one of the most interesting things I saw recently is I believe it was the Associated Press. They now classify like the term Black as like a official ethnicity term, like in the same way that Latino, Hispanic. And so in all future Associated Press publications, if they're referring to Black people, the B in Black will be capitalized. So when I identify as Black, it's a capital B Black, as opposed to like the lowercase b Black that many folks have used in the past as a disparaging or attacking term and whatnot. But
for the record, that shouldn't have been a thing, because it should have always been capitalized.
Yeah.
So never mind.
We're not gonna get into that today.
Black, it's always been capitalized. But never mind. Go ahead, Sam. Go ahead.
We're not gonna get into that today. That's another time.
No. I just wanted to put that there. And y'all go ahead. Go ahead.
I agree.
Okay.
I agree.
Okay. And then we have another question. It says, do you see a parallel between the colonial experience and the plight of African Americans?
Can I touch on the last question for just a second?
Yes, you can, Mimi.
I see Black as more of a social construct, just because you could be Haitian, you could be like Ugandan, you could be from so many other places, but when people see you, they associate it like, oh no, you're Black. And so like I mostly like when I express who I am, like I'm quick to like say Ugandan American, just like nationality, and like you can get to the roots of like where you're from. But it sometimes is helpful because there's a lot of Black people who have been displaced and can't really first like say where they're from. And so it definitely gets into a deeper history of where this nation is coming from and like people. But yeah, that's.
Thank you, Mimi. Thank you for that. Is true. Race is a social construct, but that's what we use to characterize people. So, and that's what we have with us now. So, thank you for that, Mimi, for clarifying that. So, does anyone have any comments or anything to bring about the parallel between the colonial experience and the plight of African Americans?
Well, yeah, we all suffered abuse at the hands of Europeans. We suffered physical abuse, cultural appropriation, and we suffered through basically a negative social experiment. But I would say we were spared a lot of the brutality that our African brothers and sisters had to go through in the transatlantic slave trade and in Jim Crow segregation and in chattel slavery. So there's differences, but I mean, that's the common thread. But to be honest, there's a deeper common thread, and that's the psychological effect of having been subjugated still lives with us today. Whether you're in Africa from colonialism or here in the United States coming out of Jim Crow, coming out of segregation, the psychological effect still plays on our mind. It still kind of affects our ability to move forward.
I definitely agree with Jumba that colonialism and chattel slavery are both strange fruit on the trees of white supremacy. You talk about cultural genocide. I would say to on if you talk about both things in both places. Both people have suffered in terms of people have lost cultures, people have lost languages, both, terms of inferiority, superiority complexes in terms of peoples, both African peoples and African Americans have suffered as a whole. They have both suffered. Uh, just because I would say, to me, the only difference is that the, slavery was longer. Slavery was longer, trauma was longer, but definitely the root is, Europeans got on their boats, left home, and took us and did whatever they wanted to do because they viewed us as less than human. Some would argue they still view us as less than human. And I think those would be the parallels if you look at some of the traumas and the imprint of that trauma today. People in both places will still argue with you the value of themselves and their cultures today. We're still arguing about our value today. And I think those are the parallels between the trauma inflicted from both chattel slavery and colonialism. We're still arguing about natural hair. We're still arguing about our names. We're still arguing about our languages. That's the trauma from both of these institutions from the European peoples.
So thank you for you two answering that. And then we're going to kind of move along. I see a couple of questions are trickling in, and since they relate to what we're going to be discussing later on, I'm just going to answer them. If they're not answered as you're moving on, I'm going to make sure that I go back to them. Okay. So another question that I have is, are any of you fluent in your native tongue? And what connection or I guess a better question is, does your fluency influence how you view your validity of your Ugandanness? I can say for me, I am not fluent in my native tongue. While like I can read something or if someone speaks to me, I can try and write down what's going on, but to have like full-blown conversations is something that I'm not able to do. And I can say from my perspective, people have at times used that to invalidate me and say, well, you're American because you were unable to speak your native tongue. Or people will say, or sometimes when I'm in a room full of Ugandans, since I can't speak my native tongue fluently, I think sometimes it makes it hard to be engaged or fully engaged in those environments because it's like, well, I can only contribute in English, or sometimes I'm not even fully aware of what conversation is going on. So I know that's my experience with my, I want to say lack thereof fluency. How is your fluency and how does it affect you?
So for me, I also am not fluent in Luganda. A lot of times, when I go to Uganda, I can blend in until I open my mouth, and I get called Buzungu, or but for that was one of the many things I really had to wrestle with my identity, because I go to Uganda and I can't really blend in, and here stateside I obviously don't blend in. And that's where I guess like my appreciation for this concept of diaspora really came in, and it was really through engagements through like a new generation. It was like a youth, like the youth branch of the Ugandan community in Greater Chicago, where the main goal. I don't remember the mission statement verbatim, but it entailed with identifying the healthy balance of assimilation into like wherever we are, but also holding on to our cultural identity, and like what a lot of the discussions as to what does that mean, what does that look like. It was really helpful to have those taking place growing up. But as far as speaking the language, the impact that has on my cultural identity, I've come to a point where it's like it doesn't diminish my Ugandanness. It just like I there's like a like the Ugandan diaspora. I've just created like in my mind, there's like a separate pool of like, you know, Ugandans in diaspora. Like we're our own. Like we have like our Ugandan identity just manifests itself in a different way, just due to the pioneer like nature of our existence. But I'd say yeah, we're Ugandan, and our Ugandanness is unique. You know, from those who had the privilege to, you know, like grow up in the homeland.
That's wonderfully put. That's a
I like that.
Together.
I like
yes.
that.
Personally, I'm not very fluent in Luganda, or should I say Simani Luganda. I think it would be a bit extreme to say that not knowing Luganda invalidates your identity. I don't see the connection there. But what I will say, I'm going to get a bit technical over here, but the concept of even language with human beings, it's something that makes us unique amongst animals, because we could actually have written language, and that means we could pass down information from generation to generation. So somebody like 5,000 years ago could write something, and we're kind of reliving their experiences because we understand what they said. That's why if you can understand hieroglyphs, you could understand the Egyptian culture. If you could understand Arabic, you could understand Arabs from back in the day. That's how they're able to decode all the religious texts. But I think when it comes to language, that's actually important. I'm not the best example, obviously, but that's important to understand in order to understand the culture, because my mom made it a point to always take us back to Uganda in order to, you know, every summer for us to actually learn the culture. And I've always been to like business and, you know, finance and entrepreneurship, and especially like real estate. How does capital actually work? How do you use like money to actually make changes in a society? And every time I would go back to Uganda, I noticed it's like, I could kind of get what's going on because I'm looking around me, but you're not going to be cutting deals in English, you know? And like, you don't have somebody like stabbing you in the throat, because like they might be saying like 10 million on paper, but they're really trying to come at you. So I noticed that. And then on the flip side, I took Spanish in high school, and I went to Brazil for during college for a summer. And because nobody there speaks English, I learned Portuguese on the fly. But because of that, I noticed I was able to actually assimilate to Brazilian culture and understand it very well. So language is actually super important to actually understand the culture and to really understand the experiences of others. Because like every language is set up in a way that's relevant to that culture. Like Japanese culture, honor is very relevant to them. They have a lot of terms for honor that you can't translate in English. There are a lot of terms, like certain parts of the world, very cold parts, they have different ways to say the word snow. In English, we have one way to say the word snow. And in Luganda, we have zero because it doesn't snow over there. So I think that in terms of actually understanding our culture, it's actually critical to understand the language, not just the words, not just being able to speak, but understanding the relevance. Like, why do they say nawe when they're asking for something? Why do they say, like, why do they say things that, because I would ask people, how do you translate this in Luganda? And they'll be like, it doesn't have an English equivalent. Well, that's because it's not relevant in English, but it's relevant in Luganda. But if I don't understand what that word means in that context of that culture, I can't fully understand the culture. And I can't do business over there because I'll get screwed over. And if I can't do business over there, I can't help build that economy. And then my dollar's just coming back to America, and that's an issue, you know? So, yeah.
I recently read a really good book on this was it might sound like completely unrelated. It's the title was Made in Korea. It was a story of the founder of Hyundai, and it really talked about, it illustrated the narrative of how Korea went from being like a third world country to what it is right now. And one of the beautiful things about it was like, you know, like how it was really understanding that cultural identity and taking ownership, you know, and like and like even in spite of like, because I found it really similar, like a lot of things that South, like Korea had endured, involved like a lot of, you know, invasions, colonialism, and all this and that. And I saw quite a few parallels between, you know, things that like a lot of people that look like us have endured, and it really, you know, got me thinking, what, you know, because I after reading that book, it's like I want to have that level of a cultural understanding and appreciation about Ugandan culture, and so I think that's like that's been like, I don't know, that just came to mind in terms of cultural identity, and cultural ownership, the power of it, and what it can do.
Yeah, you gain strength.
Yeah.
Sam, you made me think of like how important it is to actually understand your own history.
Mm.
Because now I'm looking back, like not just in slavery in America, but you see it in history, a consistency that if they wanted, I don't know if you guys have read The Art of War, but there's this concept that the best way to defeat your enemy is to subdue your enemy and to take them whole. But that doesn't come just in physical warfare. It also comes in psychological warfare to actually capture the enemy whole psychologically. And they typically would, like, kill the able-bodied men, enslave the women and children, the elderly, the weak, the sick. But then also take away these people's cultures and language from them. So when you mentioned that, just kind of sparked like, you also need to know your language to understand your culture and your history. Because if somebody takes your history away from you, they're pretty much controlling your thoughts and your own. They're telling you what your identity is if they take your history away.
It's like they
And who
control
you
your
are.
narrative.
That's the word.
Yeah, and I think that language is very important. I don't believe that it can take away the validity because, like, at the end of the day, like, my parents were both born in Uganda and I was born here, so that's making me Ugandan American, and nobody can take that away. But I think that in order to keep our generations alive and knowing our culture and where you're from, language is so key and crucial because, like, also, like, when you know another tongue, it allows you to ask like about stories and like the depth of our history. Like for me, going back to Uganda, one of the things that I don't like being called is a Muzungu, just because I'm just like, I'm Ugandan American, like I'm Ugandan, guys. Like I just want to like tell people, but it's true. I'm not fluent, and when I go to my grandpa, I don't understand everything that he's saying, and it breaks my heart to be in Uganda and to understand there is a disconnect. And I do think that is the language barrier. And in order to pass what I want down to my kids, it's my duty to learn my language so I can keep the generations alive and keep this culture spreading.
Well said. Well said.
If anyone has any good Ugandan history book recommendations, please throw them in the chat.
Yes, please.
Definitely. I got a few for you.
Yeah.
Well, actually, there is one. Oh, sorry. My bad. Go ahead.
Makisa,
No, but I think we're pointing out a good thing, but also a very good need and a good irony, because I think we've pointed out the importance of history and the importance of language, not only in culture but in our culture, because we'll be specific. We are Ugandan. We're talking about our specific culture. For me, I'll always admit to my privilege. I come from a family of teachers. My mom has a big family. Between my grandparents, they've had 18 kids. So, and my mom was, I think, the youngest living between my grandparents, and my dad, my grandfather had a few other kids. So my mom has probably at least maybe 6 or 7 sisters that were teachers. So I got Musisi Naule books. If some people don't know them, Musisi Naule were primers where you can learn how to read Luganda. So I know my alphabet. I can read Musisi Naule because I have that basic knowledge. If I hear a word in Luganda, I can probably write it down. Because I have that foundation, I can read words. I probably wouldn't have a comprehension, and maybe every third word I hear, I could understand. So I don't have, of course, I'm not fluent. I don't have that proficiency, but because I have the basics, I can hear a few things. I can write. I can read a few things. But in terms of who we are as first generation, in the diaspora, we do not have the luxury of what our parents have of learning.
Yeah.
Michelle just said, I have a duty to learn the language on my own. Our parents didn't have to say that. They had people to talk to. They didn't have to learn on their own. even here just a few years ago, they started a school for the small kids, but just a few years ago. For me and Vanessa and people growing up here, there was nowhere to learn how to speak Luganda. If my aunts didn't send me books, I couldn't even tell you the Luganda that I learned. And even how I identify and what I learned, I came to the understanding in high school, 15 or 16, I had to be okay with being Black, being Ugandan American, being born here in this country with what I knew and making my own space. Quiet as it's kept, that's how you had a new generation to be in, Sam. I wanted to create a space to you with whoever you were, however much Luganda you spoke, whether it's one word or you were fluent, you'd be okay with who you are, because I did not want you to be bullied with what you knew or what you didn't know like I was.
Yes.
Because when I tell you I got bullied by everybody, I did. I got bullied by people in this community for not speaking Luganda. Literally, like it got to the, and of course people were side-eyeing me because I just bring my book to functions because you're not speaking in Luganda to me. I don't even know what you're saying. So of course in being comfortable in your space, you've got to do that by choice or by force. Of course, I did it myself. I did it by force. And now what I'm doing is so people like Sam and everybody else can do it by choice because they have somewhere to go. And now I hope that when people identify in the future, you know, I consider myself first wave Ugandan American because I'm a child of the first people that came here, and all these kids are coming after me, that they have somewhere to go. And of course, for me, my people, especially my dad's side, they've done a bit in Uganda, to put it lightly. My grandfather was an important person. If you ask about Dr. Chivaya, they will know who he is when you go back to Uganda. But I don't like to talk about who my family is in Uganda to make you think I'm more Ugandan. I should stand on who I am all by myself. And nobody should have to do that. I don't think anybody here should have to pull out their family tree to prove, hey, I'm Ugandan. No. Nobody should have to speak a certain way or do a certain thing to prove that they are Ugandan. And I don't like how certain communities or how certain people approach people like us to make people feel that type of way. Because I will say at my big age, I've had to feel that type of way. Like, do you know who I am? Do you know who my father is? That people shouldn't have to have that type of conversation.
All right. And Jumba, did you get a chance to talk?
No, I mean, I think everybody made great points. I'm not going to try to belabor the points. I'll just add two things quickly. Okay. Nelson Mandela once had a quote that he said, if you speak a language that somebody can understand, you speak to their mind. But if you speak in somebody's language, you speak to his or her heart. So I think that illustrates the importance of language. And I think somebody in the chat had mentioned music and whether people use music to help understand language. I know for me personally, Uganda music is one of the primary ways I keep the little bit of Luganda and even other ethnic languages in Uganda that I know. Because as, I don't know if it was Michelle or if it was Makisa who said this, you don't really have anybody to talk Luganda with. I mean, my parents can talk to Luganda, but it's more like they were giving us directions growing up. They were telling you, they were telling you what to do. They were communicating instructions in the language. They weren't really teaching you expression. So music helps us learn how Ugandans express themselves. The only problem with music is that it's primarily focused on two topics when you talk about Ugandan music, love or maybe spirituality. So, I mean, those are good topics, but I mean, it doesn't give you the range of expression, but it's a start. So definitely music is a good tool for anybody trying to keep some of that Ugandan language or the Ugandan language.
Okay, so the topic's kind of been brought up while we're talking about, how we take language and how that, I guess we're going to make connections between us and Ugandans. But what I want to ask all of you is, what is your connection to other Ugandans? So I want to know first generation, whether it be people who have immigrated here or Ugandans in Uganda, sorry. I feel as if with me, with first generation, it's pretty easy to connect with them because we have so many topics to cover. So I feel like connecting with another first generation Ugandan is very much like connecting like anybody off the street. It's just, if we vibe, we vibe. With Ugandans who immigrate here, I think with me, it's dependent on which generation they are. With the older generation, there's not necessarily like, I think it's much easier because it's more of like, okay, hey uncle, hey auntie, you know, it's not too much of a problem. But I feel at times trying to connect to Ugandans who are my age, who immigrate here, it can at times be difficult in a sense of, okay, like what do we talk about? Because again, I was born here, I was raised here. I'm not gonna lie, most of the music I listen to are American. They're American, you know what I mean? Like I listen to all like the hip hop and R&B. So it's like, I at times feel like it may be stifled of how much I can connect, or I feel like it's like I have to work very hard to make those connections. And then with Ugandans back home, it's funny, I was actually having the conversation with some of my cousins about it. It's hard to connect to Ugandans back home who are not my family members. Because in a sense of with family, it's like, okay, yeah, we have something connection. Me and my family are very close in Uganda. We still do family chats. We do everything like that. However, outside of that, a lot of times when people talk to me, or when I felt like what we said when they talk to us, it's more of, hey, you know, things are not going good. You know, can you spare some money? And a lot of times when we have the conversations, it always comes back to, can you like money? And can you send money over because you're in the States, you know, you're big balling or whatever. So I know personally for me, it's like when I'm trying to connect back home, it's sometimes difficult to bypass that, because in my head, I'm like, okay, are you talking to me because you want to talk to me, or because you think I'm a nice person, you want to actually get to know me? Or are you actually speaking to me because you think in the long run, I can be some type of financial, I don't know what you want to call it, financial aid to you? Laughing. You're laughing. You guys are laughing, but like sincerely, like a lot of times in the back of my head, I'm wondering, do you want to talk to me because I can get you? You think I'm gonna pay your school fees? The amount of times people have asked me to pay their school fees, I'm like, I can't even pay my school fees. Please, Sally Mae's at my door. My net worth is negative, okay? But you know.
Oh, sorry, I thought you were done.
No, I'm done. Go ahead. You
Okay.
can interrupt. It's a conversation.
I think that is, I don't know why it's a very uncomfortable conversation for a lot of people, but money matters. You know, like people say money doesn't buy happiness. Well, if this recession doesn't touch you otherwise, I can't help you. It doesn't buy, it buys happiness, just doesn't guarantee it. And part of having a healthy community is being healthy in terms of like socially speaking, being good to each other, having good manners, but also being healthy economically. And my uncle, he's in his mid-50s, so he grew up in Uganda, but I don't know how familiar y'all are with Ugandan history, with the civil war that was around like in the 80s. It was a really, really bad time. And he came to America around the age of 16 or 17. So he's unique in the sense that he's part of that older generation, but he came here early enough to actually go to high school, go to college, go to medical school here and understand the system. And he said a very profound point to me, which is very ironic, but it actually helped me connect with the Ugandan community more. And that's this. He said that a lot of times Africans, when we come here, we tend to be in our own bubbles, in our own communities. Like you'd see a Nigerian church, a Ghanaian church, an African, even countries I don't know about. I'm like, how do y'all have an entire community here? But like people literally drive 1.5 hours just to see their community. But he said that Africans, what we need to learn how to do is to get outside of our community and connect with people, because that's where opportunities are. Second thing is, this country works in a system. There's no other way around it. You can be the smartest guy in the room. If you don't have a certain degree to your name, you're not going to be taken. If you didn't work for a certain company, you're not going to be taken. And I think an issue is that a lot of people in the African community, because we're staying so close together, it creates this groupthink, this homogeneity. We don't understand the system. We're not actually going out there and understanding how to even punch racism in the mouth, get what we want, be economically prosperous, and then teach other people how to do the same thing. Because you look at like Jews, for example, that's what they've done. A lot of other communities have done that. And for us, like we have this mentality like, okay, go to school, get an education, you'll be fine. That's not how the job market works. Because if you graduated in 2020, That's very different than graduating in 2016. Those are two very different scenarios.
Sure.
If you graduate with a degree in advertising or biology, that's different. So I think a lot of times, like, we don't necessarily teach each other how to actually survive in this country, how the systems work, so that those situations Vanessa's talking about doesn't happen. Because people have this mindset, especially like people who are like super religious and bring like super cultural perspectives into it, like, oh, you know, like we're family, so like people actually feel entitled to what you have because you come from the same grandfather. And it's like, it doesn't work that way, buddy, you know? So I think that's actually something our community needs to be like heavy on, is like, how do you win, and then how do you actually win? You know, because being number one in your class, that's not how America works.
So then how does that connect you, like going back to the question, how does that affect your connection to other Ugandans? Because you're talking about connections with different people, but how do you as a person feel connected to other Ugandans?
Especially as a young person trying to, like, I guess, start their career, build their career, because that 5 to 10 year period after you graduate college is super critical. To actually label, like, get that career label that you're looking for, to actually become an expert in what you want. Unfortunately, I find myself having to kind of not be as involved with the African community because I'm not getting that support, but I'm getting it from outside the community, whether it's like white people or Asians or African Americans who've really been able to build wealth in this country. I see it a lot outside. And then if I come back in, it's like, I'm not necessarily getting that same support. We might have a connection, but it's like, being broke is just not fun. It's just not.
Yeah.
You know? So you gotta build your career. You don't go to school to just have fun. You go to school to get paid.
Yeah.
So I think that this lack of actually educating people on how to do that, other than becoming a doctor, is an issue. And that's gonna separate people and cause that divide.
Yeah, I think you bring up like a really good point where I found myself at an impasse like that, like in terms of, you know, how connected do I feel to the Ugandan community, where it was like I found myself at a point where it's like because in terms of how, like, my depth of engagement, it's finite. You know, I can't 100%, you know, like engage and like invest myself, you know, in you know, professionally, and also 100% like, you know, invest myself in, like, you know, Ugandan, you know, roots and whatnot. But I felt like I shouldn't have to, like but I mean, I had goals in both categories. I have professional goals, but, you know, part of, you know, being here is you know, like with regards to, like, you know, my connection to Uganda, I feel like a lot of my, you know, my goals and my purpose should involve some form of, you know, enrichment, you know, or giving back, you know, to Uganda. And I can't really do that if I don't understand it, you know. But I can't, you know, invest in. I understand there's a huge gap of understanding that I need to, you know, cross, you know. But at the same time, there are these huge, you know, like achievement gaps, you know, to cross as well. And that's why, like, one recent development on that front that helped quite a bit is a group that we just recently kicked off, called the Young Ugandan Professionals and Entrepreneurs, like UPE. That's UPE for short. Because it started as like just like a LinkedIn group of like, you know, young Ugandan professionals and entrepreneurs, and I got added to it. And I was looking through like the membership group, and I was like, wow, there's some star power here, you know, like there's some really motivated people that have done some really cool things. And so I invited some of my Ugandan friends to it, and, you know, like, you know, the membership, you know, grew quite a bit. And, you know, it got to the point where there was a lot of interest in, like, hey, you know, we are all in very similar situations here. We are young Ugandans in diaspora. We have huge professional motivations, but we also have this weird culture. We're in this weird cultural limbo, where, you know, like we're not in Uganda right now, but we have this cultural identity, and our goals involve giving back to Uganda somehow. And so so there's like an Instagram, there's a LinkedIn, but there's also like if anyone uses the app Discord, it's kind of like Slack, but you basically there are a lot of different channels where we have all sorts of discussions about professional ambitions, goals, you know, finance, and all this and that. And so I saw a group, like, you know, that group is like it's been very helpful to me, because it's like we're all about professionalism. We're all about, you know, intellectual education, financial literacy. In fact, I think yesterday we were there was some conversation in chat about financial management. Like how do you budget? Like I don't know this or that, but so a lot of my professional development mentors, not all of them are even black. A lot of them are white, and even fewer even of the black, even fewer of them are Ugandan. But it's like I found that like it's like if I want to be able to give back to Uganda, I need to be able to understand and appreciate the intricacies about it. But I also need to be professionally pushing myself, because if I'm not professionally pushing myself, there will be nothing to contribute. Like I will have no wealth to pass. Like not only fiscally but intellectually, social capital wise, there'll be nothing to pass on if I'm not pushing myself. And so groups like UPay are huge. But I just wanted to throw that in there. But yeah, I just want to throw that in there.
Okay, I put the what UPay stands for, Young Ugandan Professional Entrepreneurs, and I also put their Instagram link in the chat if you guys are wondering. And also at the end, well, if you want to know their Instagram, it's at Y_U_P_E, and that's for the people who are on Instagram who cannot see me posting it within the Zoom chat.
Also, I'm gonna put a link if you want to join the Discord group. You have to download the Discord. You have to download the Discord app, or you could access it via computer. But I'm just gonna put the invite link there for y'all
as well. Okay, thank you, Sam.
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
I wanted to talk about systems of support and what that feasibly means. And so I think that we have enough generations of Ugandans here in America to create housing, and so it's to say when Ugandans come from Uganda to America, no matter what city they're in, it shouldn't be a displacement. It shouldn't be I don't know what job to do, or kind of like a reintroductory of learning the system, because we have people who already went through the tough of trying to figure out the system, trying to figure out the finances. But there should be a mentorship where okay, you can stay in this temporary housing for a while. Here's how to do your visa. Here's the tips, but a system in place that makes sure nobody falls through the gap. And nobody keeps going through, because I've heard story after story, and there's few people who open their houses to Ugandans to show them this is how you do it. But we are in America is based on systems. We can create a system that helps our people integrate well. And then a question in the chat was, why, what systems of support did we as first generation Ugandans had to look for outside of our community? And some of them is when you look at colleges, you need SAT classes, which are prep classes to get ready for exams, or some of it is mental health. A lot of times in our culture, we don't talk about mental health. We don't talk about what is depression. Yeah, anxiety. A lot of these things are, hey, you did what, you go to your room, and sometimes it's not necessarily healthy when somebody is actually clinically depressed but not knowing it. It causes suicide in our community, which is people who want children who are wanting to kill themselves. And something that's not talked about is in our system and in our schools is that Black students are being taught self-hate. And so as a first generation student, I realized there's some things that my mom didn't go through, but I did, because I went to school here, and she did go to school here as well. But being a little child growing up in this system where the teachers were treating you differently, and there was things that my mom didn't know what was going on, but I experienced at school. And so I think that it's important to understand what resources are not traditional and not cultural, especially mental health, and start teaching that in our communities, or else it's going to make our children suffer. And then another thing that is very controversial, but I feel I must mention, is that like when we talk about like interactions and people, I think that we don't talk enough about this idea of a predatorial like uncle or in our community.
Oh yes, they are there.
And so
Bing, bing,
we
bing,
have these known people in our community that are terrorizing our children, you know, and doing acts of sexual assault and rape and molesting to our children. And we know the people in our community, but they're protected, and that's your uncle. And so it's kind of this monopoly or this dichotomy, because like here in America, it's just like, oh, you can file a report, you can, there's like kind of like a procedure of how to handle that, but also traditionally it's kind of like silenced, and you're taught like, we're not going to do that. Like, that's family. What do you expect them to do? Go back to Uganda? No, we've worked so hard to get here. But I believe wrong is wrong. And it also induces more stress on the kids that are here, who know like, that's supposed to be my uncle, that's supposed to be my relative, yet did something and I came forward, you didn't listen to me. And so who am I? You know, do I associate with the traditions of respect your elder, but don't come forward and don't speak up? Or am I American enough to just dissociate? Because this is a big conversation. This is why some of our first generations don't associate with Ugandans. Because there's a perpetuation of this predatory uncle in our community that we allow to keep brutalizing our children. And I don't think that is okay, whether it's traditional or cultural, or like, we have to understand that, and also understand like mental health and talking and communicating. Like, how can we respect our elders, but feel also free to speak on what happened?
Yeah, I think I like how you touched on that, because while we have, there are many cases that I've heard of the predatory uncles, but then also from Ugandans that I speak to who are first generation, and sometimes some who are not first generation, who don't necessarily talk to people in the community. That's one of the top 2 reasons why they don't come into the community, is they're saying, well, you know, I had an uncle who touched me, I said something, nothing was done. Or they were the aunties who, I think I said this time before, is that children, we understand, like, I'm not saying everyone here is an adult, yes. But as children, I was very aware of what was going on around me, in a sense of, I know that you're talking about me, what I'm wearing. I know you talked about my parents. I know you talked about this. I know you're asking me these questions because you want to know more about what's going on in my life, not because you care, but you just want to know information. And I think people really underestimate how much children know and how much we are aware of what is going on. And so a lot of people are like, I don't want to come into this community because it's judgmental. Like, I've so many times heard of Ugandans first generation saying, I don't want to come to this community. I do not identify with you. I don't want to identify with you because of how you make me feel, and how you make me feel like an outsider, or how when I try to voice my concerns, or how I try to voice how I feel, or if I'm different at all, how I'm exit out. And I feel like that's something that we need to work on in our community, because if we want to bridge the gaps between the different generations in the communities, I feel as if we do need to start having conversations like that and saying, okay, like, maybe you need to change your tone. Maybe you need to understand, like, you know, like, we need to change, not that we need to change our culture, but I think when we start to say, I don't like how you do something, people are assuming that we're saying all of the culture is bad and all of it needs to be changed. That's not necessarily the point. It's more of, there's some things that are detrimental to keeping our culture alive, and we're pointing those out. So I just want to make sure that, you know, I like how you pointed out, Mimi, that we're also pointing that out and trying to bring solutions to how we can, again, bridge together the different generations and the gaps. Does anyone else have?
Yeah, Mimi, I thought that was a really good point that you made. Like, you made a lot of really good points. I think what it comes down to, like, to make it more practical, in terms of like, because you're asking like a practical how to, is kind of understanding the psychology behind it and really the structure of the culture. And I mean, y'all like, give me your like thoughts on this, but growing up, I always felt like Ugandan culture, and not just Ugandan, a lot of like Eastern cultures, like not Western, but Eastern cultures, are very ageist cultures, meaning that, okay, because somebody's older than you, they're right.
Yeah.
Because somebody's older than you, they get to crap on you. Because somebody's older than you, get to do whatever they want. And the one thing I love about America is that doesn't fly here at all. You gotta know what you're doing. Like if you're 65,
okay, boomer.
We're not gonna,
Yeah.
you know. But
Yeah.
it's ageism, and then a second thing that I figured out, and we kind of touched on it, but to give a label to this concept is being like a sycophant, you know. And well, excuse my language, but kind of being like an ass kisser. And it's like everyone needs to like when it comes to age, it's kind of like this. Like I notice like kids, like there might be siblings, like an older sibling and a younger sibling. And in order for the older sibling to like get their parents' favor, they kind of like teach their younger sibling to like kiss their ass, to kiss their parents' ass. And then their parents take their kids and go to their parents and then kiss their parents' ass. Like, look at me. Yeah. I'm such a good parent. I made my children exactly what you wanted. Obedience. And then their grandparents kiss their ass and go like, oh, you're good, you know? And then they kiss their siblings' ass and go like, hey, look at me. My grandkids are like this and that. But it's like, you do realize those are human beings, right? Just because my grandfather or like grandmother might have wanted this doesn't mean that that's what you need. But people are so caught up in like age and this, or I'm older, or you're younger, or you need like just these things, which I get where they're coming from. I get the wisdom behind it. But if you don't know what you're doing, you don't know what you're doing. And if you don't know what you're doing, you don't get respected, because that's something that's earned, not given. But unfortunately, that happens a lot where because somebody is your uncle, they're not going to put them in a place. And like even you brought up like this concept of mental health. I notice a lot of times you might say a problem and somebody will be like, oh, you got raped? I got raped. You know, we all got raped. This is cool. Like, oh, you got this? I got this. You got beaten, disrespected? But it's like, just because it happened to you doesn't mean it's okay for it to happen to somebody else. And a lot of people need to understand that that's what causes a generational curse. And going back to what I was saying earlier, my relationship with being Ugandan isn't, okay, I'm a Ugandan, I'm going to do this whether it makes sense or not. It's what principles and values can I take from this, and then what could I let go of? But I think that concept of ageism and being a sycophant, like just kissing up to somebody just so you're good in their eyes, and really just so you can get money from them so they can pay for this or that, and then like kind of manipulating those around you to also be a sycophant towards them so you can be seen as well in their eyes. It's something that I didn't notice was unusual until I started really interacting with like Americans like who are born here and Western culture more. I'm like, that's actually a dangerous aspect of a lot of Eastern cultures that just got brought here. And then it kind of causes those problems to keep recycling. So in terms of practically speaking, I think like it's kind of just being tough and telling them, listen, like this ageism thing is just not going to work. This sycophant thing's not going to work. If you're going to come to me, you better make sense. And if not, we could take it outside.
Okay. We'll take it outside. Okay.
I did want to touch on like some beautiful things about like our culture. Because your original question had touched on what's your relationship with other like first generation Ugandans, and I think that growing up in a Ugandan community really allowed me to grow up with younger kids around my age, and we are cousins and brothers and sisters. And so like, especially since we're in an age of social media, we have a group chat and it's lit. Like it's popping, or I guess let me use it. It's just so rich. It's a sisterhood that none of us, like our parents all came from Uganda, but we met when we were here in Washington. And because like our parents knew each other, like, oh, we'll put them and have a sleepover, like blah, blah, blah. And so like we just flourished this relationship where like it'll be midnight and somebody will hit up the group chat like, who's up? I need help, you know? And so this is because we're all like Ugandan and we're all around the same age, and we have this type of bond that I don't think could be built like any other way. And there has been so many beautiful like mentors. I remember like when I was struggling in school, like my mom kind of didn't really know how to help me, but she kind of just called up different uncles, different aunts. They're like, hey, can you visit Mimi? Hey, can you talk to her? And we had lunch. We had so many good conversations to kind of just be that family support, and it got me where I needed. And so that is something that like I think is beautiful about our collective like Ugandan culture. Okay.
All right. So then I have a question for you. So, because we're talking about being first generation Ugandans, but I want to ask, like, how has your Ugandan identity affected how you plan for your future, or how you are planning for your future? I know for me, it's more of I kind of think, where am I going to live in 40 years, if I'm being generous with my age. Where am I going to live in 40 years? You know, I've lived in the States my entire life. I was born and raised here. I've been to Uganda 3 times for maybe like, you know, a couple of weeks at a time. So a lot of times people are like, oh, are you going back home? Are you going back home? And I'm like, well, America is technically my home. It's the only place that I've known as my home. Most of my friends are here. You know what I mean? Like, I've established my whole livelihood here. So it's like in my head, I'm thinking, okay, like, you know, what does looking like, can I go back to Uganda? What does that look like, you know? Or even when trying to find a spouse, people like, find a Ugandan spouse. And I'm like, well, there's really not really a lot of Ugandans here. You know what I mean? Who do you want me to choose from? You know what I mean? The population
Trying
here
to play
is
matchmaker.
your parents look, they'll be like, I know someone in this state, they'll find you someone, don't worry. But I'm like, I don't want a pen pal. Like, I want to actually, you know what I mean? I don't want a pen pal. I'm trying to like see someone on a daily, but you're laughing, but you know, I'm trying to see someone on a daily basis. Like, how is you?
I'm laughing because you're serious. That's why I'm laughing. I'm laughing because
Yes.
you're serious.
Yes.
You know?
We'll
So
have to have like a matchmaking experience sharing.
Oh my god.
Or not.
or not. I don't have any experiences, but you know, if we have a master matchmaker in the chat, let us know.
We should make an Instagram page like that. Upe. We should make one for Ugandan matchmaking. You know, put your stats
Oh
in.
my
You know
god.
what I mean? Put what you're looking for.
Oh my god, that'd be lit. Or not, or that'd be hilarious
Oh
to watch.
no. Vicky just said in the chat, Auntie Josephine likes matchmaking. You better watch out, Vanessa. Oh
No,
my
Auntie
god.
Josephine has already talked to me about her sons across the states. She's like, I have a son for you. I'm like,
Oh
okay. I'm like, which state is he in? He's not that far. I'm like,
But Vanessa, to kind of like answer your question,
yes.
I think that's critical, like to think long term, medium term, but also short term. And my uncle, the one I was talking about earlier, who came here like as a teenager, he made a very good point, and I really liked it. Because for context, my grandfather, he lived to be like 98 years old, and every time I would visit him, his house was always full of people, full of kids. Everybody would come to visit him. His kids would come visit him. But my uncle made a point that old people are not liked in this country. That's just the reality. Like, you're gonna be put in a nursing home. Your kids are gonna come see you once a month, if that, kiss you on the forehead after 30 minutes, call it a day, and some nurse is gonna be taking care of you who doesn't like you. Okay, so it's like the elderly are really just not treated that well. And when he said that, he was saying like how it's important to like have a retirement plan and why he would like to go back to Uganda. But a key critical thing is really going back to wealth bidding and being economically stable enough to do that. That's critical. And then even this concept of having a spouse, because it's very different if you have a Ugandan spouse and you're trying to go back there versus you have somebody born in Colombia. Those are two completely different situations, you know? So I think like in terms of that, it's actually important to like think like, where do you see yourself retiring? Like, because America really just isn't friendly to old people unless you're wealthy. But even then, it's like people aren't going to be visiting you, your house isn't going to be full. And I honestly think that's part of why a lot of people die early, because by the time you start getting older, it's just game over here.
Okay.
No, definitely.
Yeah, I'm gonna piggyback a little bit on what Ahmad said, especially since I was just in Uganda. It's kind of been a push-pull for me because I've definitely had this question a lot, and I varied on how I've answered the question, especially since my friends, they've always seen me go and they're like, Mukisa, how are you going to live in Uganda? And for me, I'm very sensitive to the question just because, one, I work in healthcare. So I notice a lot of these things, and then to not to put all my business out there, I have a few chronic conditions, and my answer always is I would go visit a lot, but I wouldn't stay. Being in healthcare for me, I always want to be in a place. For me, if something happens, I can just, go to the doctor and get my medication. So, for me, not saying that this will, not saying how Uganda is now is what it'll be, 40 plus years, when I'm retired or whatever else. My main concern as a person with chronic conditions, and I know I'm not the only person, is that it's not like here you can go to Walgreens and get your prescription or get, any of your prescriptions. Even in being someone who's, financially and economically stable, retiring to Uganda, I feel like you have to have a certain level of health because I know my I have my aunt and my uncle, bless their hearts. I look like them. Um, they have to they have to be careful in terms of the health that they have, and not only the money that they have, to make sure that they do maintain a certain level in health living in Uganda, right, as the healthcare system is right now, and that was pre-COVID. Both my aunt and uncle have very long-term, existing conditions. With COVID now, personally, I'm scared. I'm scared for their lives right now. But for me, that's my main concern about going to Uganda to live. It's like I need to make sure that I can maintain the level of health that I do here. I can get my prescriptions whenever I want to. And I also not only get my prescriptions, that what I get on the medication bottle is what's inside there. Because as some of you may know, that's also a concern
No,
when,
you
for
actually
some people,
highlight a
when
good
they do
irony
get
because
medication in Uganda. So I think for me, in terms of retirement and planning to live in Uganda, that would be my main concern. Go ahead.
now
You
I
were
was saying that
making a
you make me
point.
think about an irony in Uganda, in that it's
Mhm.
like the number one place for clinical research in Africa, but then it
Mhm.
lacks all those healthcare resources. So like it's like they go there to test all these drugs, but you're not going to give us some of the drugs?
No.
Yeah,
Well,
you know what I
yeah,
mean?
yeah.
Mm.
You and Ahmad, you make a good point because I know this is a controversial subject for a lot of people, and it is for me too. When talks came up about testing the new vaccine for COVID-19, Uganda was mentioned precisely because of their clinical research. Precisely for the main thing that you mentioned, because it has such good clinical research testing facilities. There, Melinda and Bill Gates, bless their hearts, saying, go to Uganda, test this clinical vaccine. And yet, the average everyday person, or even those that have money enough to buy medication on an everyday basis, cannot be assured that the medication that they're buying meets current clinical pharmaceutical standards. Yes, the irony, as someone who has dispensed drugs for a living. So, for me, that is a great concern. But even now, as I support my mom in terms of keeping up our homestead in Sangay, that's something that I do think about, and something for me that's my main concern. Um, my main concern too, and even my concern for my mother, because of course, her being retired, she goes to Uganda a lot more than me and leaves me behind.
So how about the rest of you? How does Ugandan how is being Ugandan affect how you plan for your future? Or does it have an effect at all on how you plan for your future?
I think it just encourages me and inspires me to always keep a continuous and an active connection to the situation in Uganda on the ground, because we can get lost living here in America and just saying we're Ugandan American and hanging out with fellow Ugandans. And then Uganda just becomes an abstract concept because we're not actually going, or we're not actually regularly communicating with people who are actually living in Uganda. So I think I just always want to make sure that I set aside some time, set aside some part of my life that I keep that living connection with Uganda. I think that's important. And I just want to encourage all the listeners and everybody on this panel that there's no one way to make Uganda part of your future. There's many ways to go about it. I mean, I've seen different people in the diaspora do it different ways. For example, I have friends who grew up with me in New York, in New Jersey, US citizens who just voluntarily chose to relocate to Uganda, begin a life, career, family out there. That's one way. Some people are going to have that back and forth, Uganda to the United States, or Uganda to Canada, or Uganda to the United Kingdom. And they're going to kind of always have that back and forth where they go and spend some time there, they go and spend some time here, and they might have a career or a lifestyle that allows them to do that. Other people are just going to plan for that ultimate retirement in old age in Uganda. And some people, let's be honest, have already made up their minds that they're going to live in the United States. They're going to live in Canada. They're going to live in South Africa. They're going to live abroad for the rest of their life. They're not going back to Uganda. But they can always make that commitment to make charitable contributions to Uganda. They can always make that investment of being active within Ugandan diaspora communities and funneling resources back to the people in Uganda, making a material change. So I think like all of those are possible, all of those are plausible. And I don't want anybody to feel like there's any one way to incorporate Uganda in your life. You have to define the relationship to the homeland for yourself.
I love that, Jumba.
Thank you.
Sorry.
But yeah, just a thought.
I think when I think about like being Ugandan in the future, a lot of times I think about my children and like what I will pass down. And I really appreciate like in our culture, like the respect and the discipline and like the cooking, the cleaning, a lot of the times like when I went back to Uganda and I kind of like was able to see my mom's sister and my mom's like my grandpa and everything, I started to understand why my mom was so strict about like little things. But I think that it paved a kind of discipline in me that like helped me for life. And like, that's the type of things that I want to pass down to my kids. And I've also like kind of just promised myself that I'm going to buy land in Uganda that I'm going to give to my kids so they can decide what they want to do with it or if they want to build. But I want to create generational wealth, and not just like in the US, but also to like know where you're from. Like I'm going to be able to bring my kids back to Uganda, and like there's already houses, like my aunts have houses, but I want something for my generation to continue.
Okay. That's lovely. Does anyone else have another take, or do you want me to go on to the next?
Only one other thing I want to add is just that as much as we're all Ugandan Americans on this panel and we're talking to a primarily Ugandan or Ugandan American audience, I just want to also encourage everybody, just continue to think of yourself as global citizens too, and just think about yourself as Africans, period, because really we're in an age where we can connect with Africans throughout the diaspora and fellow Africans. So even those efforts of investing back in Uganda or investing back on the African continent, it doesn't have to be limited to Uganda. We're here in the United States where many of our friends, many of our college classmates are Nigerian Americans, Ghanaian Americans, Jamaican Americans, Brazilian Americans. I mean, so we're going to meet all those people. I mean, I know myself, I had an opportunity to study abroad in West Africa. I have relatives in my family who live in South Africa, and those places are hospitable and open and welcoming to us as well as children of the diaspora. And we have just as much opportunities to go and invest and connect with people, especially being Ugandans, especially being Bantu people. And when you're a member of a Bantu group, you can go pretty much from top of the Nile all the way to the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa, and you can find somebody who has some of your likeness and some of your culture. So don't be afraid to explore other parts of the African continent. Don't be afraid to build connections with other Africans throughout the diaspora. That's just another thing I want to throw out there.
Because Nairobi's next door, and that's a cold city. If y'all have been there,
Oh yeah.
It's one of the coldest cities.
And then you got Kigali. I got the
Yo,
chance to
yeah.
visit
Absolutely,
there
absolutely.
2 years ago, and it's
Yeah,
more modern than a
yeah.
lot of U.S. cities. So
Oh, yeah, they're
I like it.
developing very
Yeah.
fast. Yeah.
So we're all first generation here. So one thing I want to know is what is something that your parents have taught you that you felt was helpful or very key to you being a Ugandan moving in America, if that makes sense. Like I feel like with my parents, they taught me how to, I think they built my confidence, okay, in a sense where no matter where I move through this world, I'm focused on me and I'm going to do the best that me, Vanessa, can do. And I'm going to challenge me, Vanessa, you know? And I feel like that really did help as I moved from, again, being the only Ugandan at my mostly Black and Hispanic school. And they're like, okay, what is this girl with the accent, to going to mostly white spaces where I'm like, okay, no matter what you say to me, because yes, sometimes in those spaces I would experience different types of racism, but you know, at the back of my mind, I'm like, you're not gonna move me. Like, you know what I mean? I feel like the things that they taught me made me an unmovable force in the sense of, I don't care what you say, I don't care whatever it says. I'm about me, and I'm gonna do me, and I'm gonna be great at it, and I'm not gonna let what someone else says about me or think about me affect my moral and my ethics. So that's something that thank you, parents. And I mean parents as in like my actual parents and the people who have been like those figures in my life. I'm glad that they gave me that, because it's at least, you know, it's something I hope to pass on to whomever, whether it be a friend or child. You know, it hasn't been decided yet, but you know, yeah.
I would say this is something which is not really talked about much,
Mm-hmm.
but the older I get, the more I start seeing why it's relevant. And this is like around the world, especially in the Western world. The concept of like masculinity and being a man is like diminishing.
Mm-hmm.
Like a lot of men are comfortable just being losers, sitting at home playing video games, and they're like 30-year-olds playing. I'm like, or like marrying a woman. So that, like, I heard a guy literally say, "I want a woman who could provide for me," and I'm like, okay, you can't get your own job or something. But growing up, I noticed a lot of the men, at least I grew up around, they did a pretty good job being like good leaders and good father figures, good older brother figures, like going to school, getting an education, but not, also not being like controlling type of guys. Like, you know what, y'all know what I'm referring to, like men who have like power, but like they try to like,
Toxic masculinity.
yeah, that's the word. You know, they exude a very healthy element of that, and I especially got that from my dad. And because I was always taught, like, you know, to have responsibility, to go out there, like, you know, think about the well-being of those around you. But in from my father in particular, and like the men around me, that's definitely something I got. And then even just the whole aspect of education, because especially here in America, in the Black community, people don't actually understand how much of an issue it is, like with the high incarceration rates of Black males, police brutality against both Black men and Black women, and then even the numbers are shocking. Like apparently that for every like 100 Black women, there's like roughly 83 Black men, and in some areas even worse. So there's actually a shortage of that, especially in the Black community in America. So I think growing up Ugandan allowed me to be around healthy male role models that kind of allowed me to adopt those values and to actually use them to actually make positive change, as opposed to kind of being like controlling towards others.
One of the biggest things I've learned about masculinity, healthy, masculinity, is it's something it's like learned, like it's something that, like regardless of, my role models and the people I've exposed to, in order for me to, in order to walk in healthy masculinity, it's an intentional effort. And that's one area where I've really been grateful, with a lot of discussions that I've got to have with my dad. Like growing up with, like, my siblings and me, like, we used to butt heads with our parents pretty frequently. But like a lot of the direction that my relationship with my parents has taken recently has given me a special insight into, what like the things that they wanted to pass on to me about what it means to be Ugandan. Because like they're my parents, they had goals for, things of Uganda that they wanted to pass on to me. And some things came through good. I got my, Uganda shirt on and all this and that. But some things may not have come through, but it's only been through my intentional efforts of just connecting with, my dad, and like talking about, hey, what is it, what was it like? What did it mean to you? And learning that there were things, that he intended to pass on, like that may not have come through, but it's like, it's like just basically asking him, hey, what does it mean to be Ugandan to you? What is it, and just getting it straight from the source. That's been one of the healthiest things, because one of the biggest realizations I've had about parents, this might, come as a shocker, is like parents are basically kids that had kids, like we have more in common with them than, we might immediately realize, and might not realize until we become parents, but just cultivating that relationship to the point where, I can see that common ground. And, because in the same way that my, Ugandan experience has been weird, it's been wild for them, because they grew up, in Uganda, and they live here, and also in a time where change is just so happening so quickly. And so they grew up in a place and a time that was different, and they are parenting for folks here in America, like parents that grew up here in America had a head start, and that like a lot of this cultural stuff was just native to them. They were able to navigate those waters. But for like my parents, they struggled with a lot of things, and that's I'm grateful to have, like, that our relationship is at the point where we can talk about there, and they can just admit like, hey, we did our best, man, but we struggled with this when we grew up. It was completely different. It was but so um I think like a huge part of like and I think this is like this also involves like the question of like how does being Ugandan influence my goals. I think like a huge resource for that I've found to be my parents, just cultivating that relationship with them, and learning like getting insights from them, because there are some things growing up of some Ugandan things growing up that just naturally flowed, but there's some things that they wanted to flow but might not have flowed or came through clearly. And there are a lot of things that they can help, like especially if I don't think I've ever come to them with a question of what things, Ugandan things, can I learn to pass on to my kids. Like that's a good question that I'll definitely be posing in the next conversation I have with them, because I bet they'll definitely have a lot of detailed answers, because they had things that they wanted to pass on to me. But I think parents can be an enormous resource. And the healthier our relationships are with our parents, like that's a form of generational wealth that we can pass on, to eliminate toxic masculinity, to eliminate toxic like parent to child relations. Like it starts like it's hard to pass on something you like you don't like have. And so for me, it's like I want to have as healthy relationship with my parents as possible, so that I can pass that on. And like without making this too long of a answer, like they're like 2019 was a really interesting year of my siblings and me and our parents. We got because growing up, like there were a couple of really rough experiences, and some that left us kind of scarred. But thankfully, last year, we got a chance to all, get together and like have like what we called a ground zero, discussion, or a series of ground zero discussions and whatnot. But I won't get too much into that. I mean, there are obvious, privacy issues there, but I think that it just speaks to the value and the importance of that relationship with your parents. They have all kinds of intel that they can pass on to you, that I can pass on to, that you can pass on to, your kids and stuff like that.
Vanessa, do you mind like repeating the question for me? Only because I just want to make sure that my comments like address the crux of your question.
So it's just, what have your parents passed on to you as you got first generation Ugandan American, that you feel like helped you move through this world as a Ugandan born in America?
In America. I would say, just off there's so many. It's definitely, that's a hard question to keep to a couple minutes. But I would say three things that stand out immediately. I mean, the very first thing is the obvious, is setting an example through their actions. I mean, I think the best way the best thing any parent can give to a child is to be living proof of the way to live. Because you can say things, you can spend money on things, but you can't modeling the right kind of behavior is the best single thing a parent can do for a child. So I would say that's number one. Just my parents, the way they went about their business, the way they conducted themselves over the years, they've modeled, a good, healthy way to live for me and my siblings. So that's first. I would say the second thing is probably my mother and father being flexible, and I guess thoughtful enough to allow myself and my siblings to take the best and leave the worst of both cultures and both systems. You understand? In other words, allowing us to experience American culture, the American experience, and not just say, because they're not from the American experience, to like write off everything about the American experience, but while also warning us of some of the limitations of this experience. Then also teaching us pride and ownership of our Ugandan culture, but also not forcing us or making us feel like we have to subscribe to an exact way of living that they grew up under, because they were very obvious about, you're not growing up in Uganda. You know what I mean? Like, as much as they could try to have us living in a real orthodox kind of Ugandan lifestyle, it wouldn't really make practical sense, being that we're growing up largely in an American experience. So I would say the flexibility to allow us to experience the best of both worlds, and to allow us to kind of form an identity that includes both of those, and doesn't really make us feel captive or prisoner of either one. That was probably number two. And then lastly, the best thing my parents have done for me as far as just kind of navigating the world, specifically in my experience as a Ugandan, is exposing us to Uganda in the most thorough and the most comprehensive way. Because I say that to say, like, in my conversations, my discussions with a lot of Ugandans, both here in diaspora and even surprisingly in Uganda itself, most people's knowledge or experience or extent of their concept of Uganda is Kampala and wherever their family calls home as their village. Most Ugandans haven't traveled thoroughly throughout Uganda. And it's kind of sad to say, most Ugandans haven't been to the different areas within the country, haven't experienced ethnicities outside of their own tribal or their own ethnic identity. And my parents have blessed me and my siblings with so many opportunities to travel from the western border of Uganda to the eastern border of Uganda. We went to northwest Uganda. We just haven't been to really the northern part of Uganda. And that's the next place I want to go to. I really want to be able to experience all the cultures of northern Uganda. But I really have a bigger sense of Uganda. It's more than just Kampala. It's more than just Buganda. It's more than just Busoga. It's more than just Ankole. It's everything. And they gave us that exposure. Exposure is the best thing you can give for a child. So I appreciate those three things, I would say.
Okay. So I don't know if anyone else has anything to comment on.
I'll go ahead and go. I think for me, with my relationship with my parents, I'm in an interesting point, especially since my father passed away when I was 19. So it's been about 12 years now. So I think for me, I would say I probably would have, I guess, 2 points, especially with my dad, that I guess a little bit more common, and maybe 2 points that would be more specific as maybe being a first generation. I think 2 very specific points with my dad that would be counterintuitive were to always be on time and to call before coming. So those 2 points, to always be on time is to really respect my word and my time, and to respect others people's time, to be really about integrity, and to wherever I go, and to just call before coming, to respect our space, our home, and to have that respect for other people's home. And then I think to specifically, as a first generation Ugandan American, to always ask questions and to tell stories. I think history is important in our culture, and family history is very important. And my father, before he passed away, he talked about all my aunts, all my sengas. He talked about my grandfather. We would have these conversations, and even though unfortunately he was not as close to his sisters, and my grandfather passed away before I was born, I was able to get that history, and I was able to have those conversations with him. And I don't know that everybody gets to have those conversations. And I think that brought me a lot closer to my father and a lot closer to my family growing up here in America, and asking questions about culture and about tradition, going back to, a little bit about what Ahmad said. Some, I mean, if you really think about how tradition is, or how tradition starts and is maintained, one person did something a long time ago, and it keeps being repeated. And if we're not careful, if we're really not specific about why we keep doing the thing that we keep doing, that meaning is lost. And in some cases, if we're not careful, if we're not gentle in explaining to people why we keep doing this thing that we keep doing, why we keep having this ceremony, it loses its meaning. So if you have a child, if you have a young adult saying, well, why do we gather at the same time every year? Why do we light this candle? Why do we get dressed up like this? And you keep saying, just because, or why you keep asking me this question, it really discourages people from getting into tradition. It discourages people from being invested in keeping tradition. So I really credit my father and, my mother, my parents, for being open to just asking these questions, answering my questions about why we keep these traditions, or saying, for me being nosy is not the right word, inquisitive about these things. Well, go look it up. Here's a place to go look it up. That was a game in my household, for me to just go look things up so I would find out the answer. I really credit my parents for fostering my inquisitive nature, and for me to understand things and to learn things by asking me to go look it up, and to not always to just answer my questions all the time. So I think, now that comes second nature to me, because they had me looking stuff up early. So I think definitely, in terms of in the community, we do need to, get back to having that understanding and that explanation of tradition.
Okay. And then has everyone touched on that topic? Making sure.
I didn't speak, but what I would say is what I learned from my parents is intentionality and purpose. And when that, growing up, the meaning of my name was often spoken of, and my dad passed away when I was young, but my mom told me how my dad named me Michelle because it meant one who resembles God. And the story of my family is so beautiful, because my dad came from Uganda to minister and pastor and spread the good news all over America. And it's just beautiful kind of to understand the intentionality and the purpose behind everything we do, and watching my mom grow up and saying how if we eat, everybody else eats. She transports food to the people who don't have food, the Ugandans that come here, she houses, and the selfless intention she has with everything she does. And that's why, even in me growing up, I'm a fighter, I joined the military because I'm just I want to fight for people. And I think the biggest thing that my mom and my father taught me was, no matter how big, no matter how small, just make sure that the matter and what you're doing, and fight for that, with all your heart. And so that's something that I really take away, and the power of community, knowing people by name. And my dad did do that, because there's many people in each state. I don't have to use a hotel wherever I go, because there's somebody that my dad touched and spoke to, and that's family. And that's beautiful. So that's what I learned from my family.
All right. So our last and final topic, because of how the environment is, I thought that we should probably touch on the Black Lives Matter movement. And what does that mean to you? Okay. I know as a Black woman, because I identify, like I said before, as Black, Ugandan, American, you can mix all those words together. That's what I identify as. And I really think with me, I think it really hits home, especially since Black women are not necessarily touched on or spoken of in this movement. It tends to be a very Black male dominated and Black male ran, and we're so focused on trying to help and make sure there's justice for Black men, and that presence is so strong. Whereas I feel as with Black women, we don't necessarily get that help. So as someone who identifies as Black, and as, again, growing up here and having other people also choose to identify me as Black, it does mean a lot to me. And I try to make sure that educate others on the Black Lives Matter movement, educate them in however way, whether it be resources or donating or whatever, to make sure that awareness is being brought to not only Black men, but Black women, Black trans women, Black children, and making sure that everyone's lives are being put into consideration. How does that resonate with you guys?
I felt that on a spiritual level, personally, because there is so many voices that are being boxed out of the narrative. But I think that, like, with every movement, and even if you look at the history of like Black liberation in America, a lot of it has been centered around Black men. Like, Black men got to vote, and then it was white women. And then like Black women are almost not talked about. But I believe that whenever, like, even in this movement, I think that there is beauty and power in getting together and also addressing, like, we need to change this narrative. You know what I'm saying? Like, we're going to get to like peace, justice eventually, but like it has to be together because there's so many people who need it.
Okay.
I am going to be very brief.
Okay, girl.
I'm gonna, y'all, I don't know if y'all can see this. I just finished this book, When They Call You a Terrorist, the memoir of Patrice Concolors, who is one of the founders of the hashtag and the movements Black Lives Matter, a Black queer woman. And I highly suggest all of you find it and read it. It will give you an eye-opener in terms of how greatly the movement has been hijacked from the 3 Black women who started it. I also implore you to go into the hashtag Say Her Name, which also focuses on the Black women who have been victims of police murder, who have been murdered in police custody and detainment. And I definitely would agree with Michelle that yes, a lot of movements have been centered with center Black men. Black women have been left out. Black gay men have been left out, definitely. But I do believe in terms of Black Lives Matter, we can take it back. We cannot lose focus in what's at stake in terms of the injustices that have occurred and what we're fighting for. I mean, to date, only one of Breonna Taylor's murderers have been brought to justice. And even up to now, so many other instances of police murder and brutality have happened. So I think we cannot afford to be of a one-track mind when it comes to these issues. And we also need to be aware wherever we are in terms of not only the movement, but in terms of policy changes that need to be had, like ending qualified immunity for police, that we need to push for so that police accountable and not just with our tax dollars.
Okay.
Mm. Makisa, you make a good point, and you mentioned about like a movement being hijacked, and that's kind of always been my concern with any movement, is that it starts with an idea, and movements are good because it's a call to action, but eventually you have to get past movement and get towards action, and action can happen in many ways, in many forms, and it doesn't necessarily have to be through an organization. Individuals have the power to take action within their own lives and within their own communities where they're living. So definitely, we're all fighting for a more just America. We all want to see a country and an environment where we're honored, we're respected, and where we can have faith that we will receive fair treatment in the courts, in our governments, in our schools. But to go off what you guys are saying as far as Black women maybe not being empowered, or maybe not being being turned to for leadership in a crisis moment, maybe one way that I see, at least, is if we think about within our Black communities, and I'm talking about Black public schools and Black public hospitals in predominantly Black cities here in the United States. Unquestionably, most of the Black school teachers, the Black administrators in Black public schools in Black cities are Black women. And so if we really want to be about helping Black women and giving them a platform for leadership, it's about making that investment in those women who are teaching our babies every day. We talk about our hospitals, Black nurses, Black hospital staff who are from the community often. I think we need to support our local public hospitals as far as the people who are on the front lines of providing care to those who are the most afflicted in our community. And I think if we can look to the women in our community who are already doing those things and maybe hear their ideas of how we can achieve progress, I think then we can do two in one. We can do two in one. We can uplift our Black community and we can support Black women in taking that leadership role. So just a thought.
I believe in addition to like the practical actions that take place, I think it's important to recognize that I think there's a systemic side to this as well. I think it's important in the same way that we're out here educating people on systemic racism and how this is not a bug, it's a feature. I think it's important to take a step. Like I've had to interrogate some of my mannerisms and thoughts. Like, hey, I'm not gonna get that personal on here, but I think it's important to interrogate, hey, what there, because I don't know how to explain this without getting personal, but I do believe it's a systemic issue of of like the male narrative always being the narrative that gets all the attention, the volume, and despite the fact that a lot of Black females in my life have been huge supporters, huge vocal, not only vocal but also by action, and the appreciation that I give back in the form of the narratives that I defend and project and give volume to, I recognize the disparity there. And I think in our same with the same energy that we're combating systemic racism, let's combat systemic misogyny. Let's combat systemic homophobia. Let's combat with the same energy, because I don't know. Yeah, I do believe in addition to their practical actions we could take, but let's deal with the systemic side of this as well.
Yeah, definitely, there's a micro and a macro level. I agree, Sam.
So is there anyone else who wants to give a thought on it, or any final comments anyone wants to make before we log out, because we're 5 minutes past 9.
Wow.
This went fast, right?
Yeah, this has been good. This has been good.
Any questions anybody has that they want to kind of throw out there before we all log off? I'm trying to scroll through to see. Do you, and the question, half of a question is, So what would you raise your children to be? I know that's completely off topic, but as in the sense of that we're supposed to, you're a Ugandan person that's born here in America. Yeah. Some, like, you have mixtures of identities. Some people are saying, well, I'm Ugandan American, I'm African American. I want to be called Black. I don't want to be called Black. What are you going to pass down to the newer generation?
Everything, all of those things. No, I think it's hard to say. First of all, I'm not a parent yet, but God willing, I'll be happening soon. And I think the same way our parents tried to give us the best of both, I would try to give to my children as well. But definitely, that pride in Uganda and the Ugandan ancestry, that's important. It's important to pass on to our children. And we talked about all the ways we can do that. So I think it's important to do that. But now that I'm positioned differently than my parents, in that my parents were in a foreign land here in America trying to forge their way. But I've been born and raised in this land. So I hope that my children are even better adjusted and better prepared to make strides in this country. And they can take it to such a further level. And by succeeding on a higher level here, they're going to be able to make an even greater difference back home in Uganda. And I hope to always keep the connection alive and make it a real connection and make them develop a personal connection. So I actually feel optimistic by the fact that they're going to be empowered by the fact that they have that ancestry, they have a real connection to where they come from, and they're not going to be suffering through kind of the trials and tribulations that we went through as first generation. They're going to be better positioned to advance in this society. So, I'm hopeful. I guess I'll leave it there.
Okay, I'm guessing by the a lack of audio that I guess everyone we're okay or good on that question. I want to say thank you to all of you panelists and people who came in, asked questions, came in and listened. I want to thank you for being here, because you could have been anywhere else, but you're here with us. That's right. You're here. You're here to listen, here to ask us questions, kind of combat our mind of thought, and we're here to also bring up new discussions in our community so that we can again start to have these conversations. And I really hope that after this we are able to continue to have these discussions outside of this Zoom chat, or outside of YouTube, or wherever you're watching from. Yes. So anyone, I don't know if you want to give your socials, or you want to have a final anything, or you.
Oh, sure. Anybody who wants to keep the conversation going, you can send me an email. You see my name, Jumba. My last name is Mugwanya, jmugwanya@yahoo.com. I'm happy to answer any emails, keep the conversation going. Instagram. I guess I'm not usually having these conversations on Instagram, but I'll put it out there. Just get in touch with Vanessa, and she'll put you in touch with me, I'll say.
Okay, yes. So let us know how it went. Any questions, comments, concerns, different pointers, whatever it is. I would very much love to hear it from you guys, and how we can do better, and whether you guys would love to have conversations like this. If you guys want it more, just let us know. We can see what we can do. But I really do appreciate all of you guys being here when you didn't have to. Love you guys. And maybe we'll see you guys another time. All right.
Thanks, everyone. Everyone be safe in this time, and have a good evening.
That is true. Be safe.